Hello, dear Kababayan. If a foreigner stays in the Philippines long enough to no longer be called a guest, familiar enough to have a regular seat every morning, and attached enough to stop counting the days until they go back, what is it that keeps them here? Every year, tens of thousands of foreigners choose to settle long-term in the Philippines. And among so many destinations, there are five provinces that stand out the most, places most often mentioned when talking about foreigners who don't just come and go, but truly live, stay, and build roots. Today, Pinoy Global Explorer will take you through these five provinces, not to talk about how beautiful the Philippines is, but to look at what makes people stay. A pace of life that isn't rushed, people who feel close enough that no one feels like a stranger, and kindness that happens as naturally as breathing. Foreigners don't choose to stay because life is easier. They stay because in certain places they find a sense of belonging. If all of this sounds familiar to you, stay with us a little longer, because the very first province we're about to visit might make you realize something important. It's these very Filipino qualities that make others choose to stay for the long run. Now, let's begin this journey together, right now. Cebu Province, where people stay because of how Filipinos live. Michael came to Cebu from the United Kingdom in his early 50s, carrying a familiar mindset of someone who had already passed through many Asian countries. Stay a few months, experience the place, then move on. He wasn't looking for a second home, and he never imagined staying long-term. But 12 years later, Michael is still living in Cebu, not in an area set aside for foreigners, but within a community where his presence is no longer something unusual. Cebu doesn't try to impress people with glamour. It's crowded, fast-growing, sometimes noisy and chaotic. Yet within that rhythm, many foreigners come to understand something deeply Filipino. People come before everything else. In Cebu, Michael isn't asked why he stayed. He isn't reminded that he's an outsider. And people simply ask if he's doing well today, if he's eaten properly, and whether he needs any help. That kindness isn't advertised. It isn't treated as something special. But it's steady enough to keep someone there for years. Of course, there is a cost. Traffic keeps getting worse. The city changes quickly. And there's a feeling that Cebu is trading its slower pace to keep up with the world. Still, what makes many people stay isn't because Cebu is perfect. It's because, even amid all that change, Filipinos here have held on to their way of living, close, accepting, and never asking anyone to prove their worth just to belong. Have you ever thought that what seems ordinary might actually be the very reason people choose to stay in the Philippines for the long run? Negros Occidental, where people stay because no one is left alone. Eleanor came to Negros Occidental from Canada after retirement, carrying a fear many older people living far from home quietly share, the fear of becoming invisible. She wasn't looking for excitement. She didn't need international comforts. All she wanted was a place safe enough to live out her remaining years in peace. But what made Eleanor stay in Negros wasn't the weather or the cost of living. It was the way Filipinos here don't let anyone drift out of the community. In Negros Occidental, care doesn't come through curious questions. It shows up in small things. Neighbors noticing when a door stays closed too long, familiar faces asking whether she's eaten today, and dinner tables that always have room for one more person. No one calls it kindness. And it's simply the normal way of life. And yet, that very normal is what makes many foreigners stay for the long term. In many other parts of the world, this kind of attention has quietly become a luxury. Of course, Negros isn't perfect. There are fewer opportunities. Life moves more slowly, and sometimes the quiet forces people to face themselves. But what's admirable is that Filipinos here don't see slowness as failure. They see it as a choice, one that keeps people close to each other. Eleanor once said that in Negros she didn't need to fit in because the community opened itself to her before she even had the chance to knock. Have you ever thought that a truly livable place isn't one with endless things to do, but one where, if you disappeared for a day, someone would notice and ask how you are? Perhaps that very Filipino way of living is exactly why Negros Occidental holds on to those who come to stay. Palawan, where people stay because Filipinos know how to live with nature. In Palawan, life doesn't run on precise schedules. Boats can be late, electricity can be unreliable, and not every day goes according to plan. But within that very imperfection, many foreigners come to understand something deeply Filipino. Nature isn't meant to be conquered, it's meant to be lived with. Daniel, a freelance designer from Spain, has lived in Palawan for many years and learned this lesson early. He came from a world where everything had to be fast, on time, and efficient. But in Palawan, Filipinos don't apologize for a slower pace. They see it as a way to keep things from going too far. Daniel says what made him stay wasn't the blue seas or the deep forests. It was how locals respect limits. They know when to stop, when to wait, and when to let nature decide. Of course, Palawan isn't easy to live in. Healthcare is limited, transportation can be difficult. Comfort isn't always available when you want it. But what's admirable is that Filipinos here don't see these shortages as a sacrifice. They see them as a conscious choice to protect something more important. They don't sell nature to buy speed. They don't trade the future for the present. That way of living is why many foreigners, even when they could leave, choose to stay. Have you ever thought that a place worth living in isn't the one that gives you the most, but the one that teaches you how much is enough? Perhaps Palawan doesn't hold people by its beauty alone, but by how Filipinos quietly protect what belongs to everyone. Bohol, where people stay because of how Filipinos nurture family. Bohol isn't a place that overwhelms you at first glance. Life here moves slowly, very slowly, so much so that for many foreigners, the first few months pass with a quiet feeling that nothing is happening. But it's exactly that slowness that has made Bohol a long-term choice for many multicultural families. Maria, an Italian woman married to a Filipino husband and raising 2 children in Bohol, once said that here she doesn't have to race against time to be a good mother. Filipinos in Bohol place family at the center of life, not through big statements, but through how they spend time with their children, how they protect shared meals, and how afternoons aren't constantly broken apart by work. Of course, Bohol doesn't offer many career opportunities, and development is slow. And at times, younger people feel their choices are limited. But what's admirable is that Filipinos here don't see slow living and prioritizing family as falling behind. They see it as a value worth protecting, even as the outside world moves faster. Maria says what keeps her here isn't convenience, but peace of mind. Her children grow up in a community that pays attention, reminds each other, and shares responsibility. Have you ever thought that a place worth living in isn't the one that gives you the most opportunities, but the one that gives your children a complete childhood? Perhaps it's this quiet way Filipinos in Bohol protect family that leads many foreigners to stay for the long term, not because the future looks brighter, but because the present feels solid and secure. Benguet, where people stay because Filipinos know how to respect distance. Benguet doesn't welcome people with loud warmth. Here, everything happens in just the right measure. Greetings aren't overly familiar, questions don't cross into private life, and care always comes with clear boundaries. And it's precisely this sense of restraint that makes many foreigners choose to stay for the long term. Thomas, a German researcher who has lived in Benguet for more than 8 years, once said this was the first place where he felt respected without having to explain who he was. Filipinos in Benguet aren't overly curious. They don't intrude into personal space, but they're not distant either. They help when needed, show up when asked, and step back when you want to be alone. What's admirable is that this respect doesn't come from social distance, but from a culture that understands boundaries as a way to preserve harmony. Of course, Benguet isn't easy for everyone. The climate is cold, the rain frequent, the terrain challenging, and the sense of being far from the center can sometimes feel isolating. But Filipinos here don't see quiet as a lack. They see it as space, space to think, to work, to live slowly, without needing to justify it. Thomas says that in Benguet, he learned how to be alone without feeling abandoned. Have you ever thought that a truly civilized society isn't one where everyone is close, but one where each person is respected exactly as much as they need? Perhaps it's this very Filipino sense of moderation that has made Benguet a place many foreigners choose to commit to, not because it's comfortable, but because it allows them to live honestly as themselves. After passing through these 5 provinces, what remains may not be the names of places, but a quiet question we ask ourselves. What is it about the Philippines that makes others choose to stay, even when they are always free to leave? Not perfection, but the way Filipinos live with one another every day, close enough that no one is forgotten, accepting enough that others are allowed to be themselves, and grounded enough to hold on to these values even as the world keeps changing. These things may feel so familiar to us that they're sometimes dismissed as ordinary, but for many foreigners, and they are more than enough to call this place home. If this video made you pause for a moment or feel a quiet kind of pride, stay with Pinoy Global Explorer. There are still many stories about the Filipino people waiting to be told, stories that may help us understand who we are and why that matters more than we often realize.